Welcome to History vs. Hollywood. Please head to historyvshollywood.substack.com to subscribe and always be the first to hear about a new episode directly to your inbox. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome.
Yeah, sorry, that was too weird. Okay, I'll just count down. That's just also fine. I can just listen for that.
You're going to do the poem again?
Yeah. Yeah, shall I give it some more oomph this time?
Yeah, go on. By day.
In a world.
Yeah, nice. Yeah.
Yeah, no. Okay. By day, a man enjoys his lord's favor, but at night, he is crushed and entombed, like a victim of a Qin Shi Huang's purge. Like the cycle of day and night are the vicissitudes of man's fate. A sunflower turns towards the sun as though the light were unchanged. So will I remain loyal, even if my fortunes are unchanged. My dear comrades in the capital are all ghosts. Prisoner on a southern island, I alone have survived. Life and death are, beyond doubt, bequests of heaven. I ask only that my heart and soul might remain on earth to protect His Majesty. That was a poem written by a man called Saigō Takamori in the year 1863 during his time in exile. Saigō Takamori would be the inspiration for the character Katsumoto in the absolutely epic film starring Tom Cruise, The Last Samurai. And that is going to be the subject for this next History vs. Hollywood series. So hello, everyone, and welcome again to the podcast. My name is Jack Cooper, and I'm joined once again by my brother, Charlie. Charlie, how you doing?
Yeah, very good, mate. Very good. Excited to get into this one, definitely. Let's get going.
Saigo. Saigō Takamori was a figure of enormous importance in an era-defining clash of ages in Japan called the Meiji Restoration. Embodying all of the traits of the old world and the new, Saigo's life would reflect Japan's emergence as a modern nation-state. Historians would look back on this era and name Saigo as the last samurai. Saigo would die on the 24th of September, 1877, leading the final samurai rebellion against the Imperial Japanese Army at the fated Battle of Shirayama. His death marked the end of an age. Saigo led 500 samurai against 30,000 imperial soldiers of the Meiji government, a government he had once built that was now bent on destroying him and his entire way of life. His life and death would be the inspiration, as I mentioned earlier, to the character Katsumoto in the film The Last Samurai, starring Tom Cruise and directed by Edward Zwick. Using the film as a guide, we will ask the question over the next potentially 4-part series. Who was Saigō Takamori, and why did his death at Shirayama mean the dawning of a new era for Japan? Dun dun dun.
Well, it's a big topic, isn't it? Exciting stuff.
Yeah, it is a big topic. 4 episodes is the aim, but we got a little out of hand on the previous series with William Wallace, so who knows? But we will try our best. As I say, it's the inspiration for the film, but the events of the film depicted in The Last Samurai take place towards the end of Saigō Takamori's life. He lived a very long and interesting life. And to get to the point of the movie, which we certainly will, we need to go a little bit further into the background, learn a little bit about feudal Japan itself, and Saigo's childhood, his upbringing, his early career, etc., which will all bring us in a, hopefully not roundabout way, to his death on the Battle of Shirayama. Charlie,
Right.
have you seen the film?
Yeah, I've seen the film. Loved the film. Tom Cruise. We spoke about this the other day, but I have a lot of. I'm quite weirded out by Tom Cruise as a real person. And so I always sort of have this idea about his films that I'm not going to enjoy them. But then I don't know. He's a hell of a leading man, isn't he? You can't not be entertained when watching Tom Cruise.
No, he's a star. He's a star. What could he say? But yeah, he does slightly give me the willies as well. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. On this note, Japan, feudal Japan, and pretty much all Japanese history I know next to nothing about. So I'm assuming by the term feudal, we are swords and shields, sort of bows and arrows, armies against armies. I'm sort of comparing it to European Christian feudalism. Is that fair? Is that a fair comparison? Samurais are kind of knights. Is that?
Yeah, you're right. That is actually pretty much bang on, but there are some key differences. Basically the same. Samurai are a warrior class. Everyone else is serfs, etc. So it shares a lot of similarities with European feudalism. But let's learn a little bit about feudal Japan, as it'll be important in the progression of this story that we understand a little bit about the scene into which Saigō Takamori was born. So first things first, the political classes in feudal Japan. So there are three pretty important to the story going forward. You have the emperor and his family, the Kuge, historically in charge of everything, supposedly directly descended from the gods. Back in the day, not at the time of Saigō Takamori, but they were an absolute monarch. They held absolute power over Japan. But slowly that power was filtered out to the daimyo, who are the sort of warlords that ruled the domains of Japan at the time of Saigo's birth. Yeah, the Kuge is based in Kyoto. And by the time Saigo was born, essentially are politically sidelined. However, they still remain mystically very important and essentially are the wellspring for all political power that could flow in Japan.
So sort of like our royal family, except maybe a little bit more holiness accredited to them.
Exactly. If we thought King Charles was directly descended from the gods and that without his blessing, a prime minister could not legitimately deign to rule over the English people, then yeah, it'd be more like that. Basically.
There's sort of that, isn't there? The king does have to approve them still, but it's if you don't say yes, you lose your job. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, but these guys, they're sidelined. They were not actually ruling. They were essentially encouraged to busy themselves with calligraphy and tea ceremonies and, these sort of soft but important parts of Japanese political life. They didn't wield any real power at the time. As I say, the power primarily sat in the hands of the daimyo. These were rich warlords who slowly gained power, basically from around the 12th century onwards. Sort of, murderous, adventurous toughs who, like most oligarchies, over time sort of legitimized themselves through, history and stories and I guess the power flowing from the emperor as well.
It's all sounding very familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny how it all sort of seems to work out that like this way, no matter where you are in the world.
Mm.
Yeah. The toughest, meanest people rise to the top and then convince everyone that they were positioned there by God. They are, they're ruling as an oligarchy of rich families until the year 1603. So about 250 years before the time of Saigo Takamori, where the Tokugawa clan rose to power at the Battle of Sekigahara and became shogun. They're based in Edo, which is now Tokyo, and it's essentially a decentralized management of the country. So the daimyo, they rule these domains as their own personal fiefs in deference to the Tokugawa clan, who are known as the shogunate.
So there's still an emperor. Shogun is sort of ruler, leader, president.
Yeah, he's basically top warlord.
Okay.
And the emperor is nominally the leader of the country and can tell the shogun what to do, but realistically, the shogun tells the emperor what to do at this point.
Sure. So it's sort of like Saxon England, where there was obviously Wessex, Essex, all that kind of stuff, but there was one general considered top warlord.
Yeah,
but they ran their own thing.
The Brett Walder type thing.
Okay,
that's what they call it. Yeah. And then making up the backbone of the entire country is the samurai. So these are the vassals of the daimyo. Yeah, they're the landed knights of Japan. But on top of that, they're much more important to the running of the country. They're the educated class. Most of them are highly educated. They're the landowners, the scholars, and administrators in the time of the ruling of the Tokugawa shogunate. Before the coming to the power of the shogunate, the Sengoku period, known as the period of the warring states, the samurai did a lot more fighting back then. But since the shoguns have been in power, essentially there's been 250 years of relative peace. So the samurai have had to do something. And that means they essentially become sort of bureaucrats in helping to run the country. But all carrying swords and all still very violent, but they also sort of process tax returns and stuff like that. It's all very exciting.
Warrior scholars.
Exactly. And yeah, speaking of warrior scholars, have you heard of the term Bushido?
Yeah, so this is the difference. I've been doing a lot of comparing to Europe, but I guess this is at its core the difference. The dressing is the same, but the stuff at the center, the spiritual stuff is different. And this is the spiritual center, isn't it, Bushido?
Yeah, so we have a similar thing in Europe, which was I guess the concept of chivalry. You could maybe compare it to that. However, this was taken, I guess, far more seriously. And obviously, by the time of the 1800s, there weren't many landed knights knocking about Europe on horses with, armor on and saving fair maidens. But in, the 1800s in Japan, that was still very much the case. The samurai were still very much part of the deal. They followed this thing called Bushido. It's important to understand it because having a good understanding of Bushido will help you understand the decisions that Saigo makes in his life. Just a few of the core principles: loyalty, absolute loyalty to one's lord, honor, upholding personal and family honor, even through death if necessary, courage, of course, integrity, very important, compassion. All right, I think they might be kidding themselves a bit here, but as you might find out that, as honorable as the samurai considered themselves, they were essentially like armed bullies keeping a populace under control via the sword. But I'll let you make your own mind up about that.
Yeah, it does say here on your notes, samurai could kill serfs out of hand without consequence. So I guess the compassion had to be the only thing stopping them, really. So maybe they were compassionate. Yeah, I guess there's still some standing, aren't there?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if you've seen the series that came out this year, Shogun. If you've not seen it, it's epic. But there is a scene in the first episode of that where samurai very flippantly turns around and kills a villager that he's supposedly in charge of looking after for just getting in his way, and doesn't even sort of bat an eyelid about it. Just takes his head off with the sword. So,
I guess they're not Christian yet, are they? So
some of them were.
Oh, were they? Oh, Christianity had reached. Okay,
Christianity had reached in and around the period of the Tokugawa shogunate coming to power. So around that era.
And I'm only mentioning that Christianity thing because obviously we've got to remember, as it's always drilled home about the Romans, that before Christianity, the idea of as like valuing them at the same way as you was a sort of an alien concept. So samurai could be compassionate to maybe upper class women and themselves, I suppose, but the idea of being compassionate to a serf for them would probably be the idea of us being extra compassionate to a pig, or
basically. Yeah, the common folk in Japan were completely, they had no political entity at all. They didn't have a vote or a say in anything. They were essentially there to provide for the samurai, the daimyo, and the kuge class of the country.
Okay, so if this Bushido was broken, what might these samurai do?
Yeah, so we touch on the concept of seppuku. Now, have you heard the phrase?
Oh yeah, I mean it was bandied about a lot when we were kids. It's a fascinating idea, isn't it? It's sort of a noble suicide, sort of fits into a very heroic idea that I think kids quite liked. Sort of the legend of the samurai, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I even remember going on a ski trip to Austria once with on a school ski trip, and there was a run there called Harikiri, which is supposedly this extremely dangerous downhill run in Austria.
I remember the name, actually.
Yeah, and harikiri is a kind of modern term meaning directly belly slitting, which was another term for seppuku. So seppuku is essentially an honorable suicide, usually committed by samurai, but other members of society as well. Essentially, when they've either lost a battle or they've brought dishonor to themselves. It's famously committed by the subject has a short sword, which he stabs himself in the belly and sort of rakes it across, spilling his guts onto the floor. To do that part himself. But usually they have a second or an assistant who then, once they've seen that the chap has done the dirty deed himself, will then take his head off to not prolong his suffering. Yeah, it's seen as a noble death. Pretty grim, pretty wasteful, I'd say.
Yeah, but it forces you not to lose, doesn't it?
Yeah, true.
Am I right in thinking that it happened at the end of World War II, or am I making that up?
Yeah, so the Japanese have to be honest, have a very strange relationship with suicide. And in the Second World War, there was a lot of suicide by defeated Japanese soldiers, throwing themselves off cliffs, holding grenades against their heads, and then obviously, the officers are still committing seppuku with the knives and the samurai swords as well, those that could afford them.
Wow.
Yeah. It even actually has made it all the way through into the 21st century. Not quite the same way with the swords or anything, but in 2007, a Japanese cabinet minister, this guy called Toshikatsu Matsuoka, was being investigated for some sort of political scandal, and to save himself the dishonor of probably embezzling some funds or something like that, he committed suicide. And the governor of Tokyo at the time referred to him as a true samurai for preserving his honor. To me, I think just, I'm not sure if it preserves your honor. You've done something bad, and just because you killed yourself, you're like, he didn't do anything wrong. He still did the wrong thing.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Obviously, we've been raised to think that suicide is cowardly, or at least that was sort of the old-fashioned thinking when we were kids. And so I guess I've still got that idea ingrained in me. It's like an easy way out. But I guess it's just a matter of perspective, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they do have a... Yeah, I mean, we can explain as much as we can about feudal Japan, but to put yourself into the shoes of these people, it's almost impossible. I think that the American soldiers, the Marines who were fighting them in the Pacific in the Second World War, when they first encountered this sort of like suicidal tendencies of the Japanese soldiers, were horrified and shocked by the wastefulness. People just wouldn't surrender. They'd blow themselves up with grenades to take a few more Marines, and something that they really couldn't understand. And to be honest, in the West, we can't still to this day really understand.
We could talk about that topic all day, but
yes,
we need to get on. Let's meet our hero, shall we?
Yes. So before we do that, it's important to just understand where our hero comes from. The Satsuma domain, which is a lovely name for a place.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah. So at the time of Saigo's birth, the shogunate are the ruling daimyo, and I told you there in Edo or Kyoto, not Edo or Tokyo. Saigo comes from a place called the Satsuma domain, which is located in far southwestern Kyushu, which is sort of...
Actually, I did look up a while ago. It is actually where the Satsuma orange gets its name from, even though it originated in China. So there you go.
Ah, how exciting.
Sorry, continue.
No. It's good. Yeah, at the time, it's essentially considered a sort of remote backwater. It's, I think, something like 100 days walk from, and that will become a factor of Saigo's life, that long stroll. So we'll tell you about that in a little bit. Despite this isolation, Satsuma was unique. It ruled the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is in modern-day Okinawa, which gave them rare access to ocean-going ships and contact with outsiders. Because when the shogun had come to power after the Battle of Sekigahara, they'd essentially banned contact with the outside world. They banned the production of ocean-going ships. They removed all foreigners from the vast majority of the country and kind of restricted trade to certain areas. So the vast majority of Japanese at this point had probably never seen a white person or a foreigner of any sort. But the Satsumas, they actually had direct contact with the outside world because of this ruling of the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is, as I say, Okinawa. They were ruled by a family known as the Shimatsu. They were Japan's oldest warrior house. And they've been in charge for over 600 years. They never considered themselves lesser than the shoguns. They thought, despite being on the losing side of the Battle of Sekigahara, their strength was left untouched. They basically just considered that they were their equals. They just happened to have lost one important battle 200 years ago. So we're never that deferential to the shogunate.
Sure.
They're the capital, Kagoshima. And this was laid out, as most Japanese cities were at the time, in sort of rings of strict hierarchies. In the center, you would have had the daimyo's palace. On the outskirts of that, you would have had the houses of the elite retainers, so the sort of high-ranking samurai. And then further out, you'd have the low retainers who were still samurai, but were sort of restricted to menial bureaucratic jobs or guard duty, things like that. They lived in this sort of inner district with less glamorous names, such as Cat Shit Alley, places like that, sort of ramshackle houses.
Oh, wow, yeah. Sounds Game of Thrones names, doesn't it? Flea Bottom and...
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of stuff.
And it was into one of these sort of humble homes in and around Cat Shit Alley in Kagoshima that Saigō Takamori was born in the year 1827.
Samurai has sort of become a catch-all phrase at this point for what? Citizen. If you can be a clerk or a guard or a...
Yeah, so as I say, the samurai were the clerks and the guards, etc., because they didn't have any wars to fight. They were all warriors first, but there was there was a ranking system of about 10 ranks. At the top, obviously, would be the lord's attendants, all the way down to the bottom two were guards and police. Anything in the sort of top 8 were usually bureaucratic. And Saigo's father was in the 8th rank of the 10 ranks of samurai. Very low in the white-collar hierarchy, but still a full urban samurai. Make the differentiation there because there are urban samurai and there are rural samurai. Urban samurai, again, were a far higher rank than the rural samurai. An urban samurai could kill a rural samurai with impunity, and a samurai could then kill a commoner with impunity. So that kind of shows you the difference between them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Strange system. What's it killing with impunity, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of death in the world. So Saigo's father, hardworking white-collar samurai. He worked in a taxation office in Kagoshima. Very little is known about Saigo's mother, which is disappointing. But yeah, unfortunately, women in this time period were definitely of the second-class citizen variety. So it's a bit of a shame. Saigo was the eldest of 7 children. And they lived in a sort of cramped, ramshackle house filled with extended family that the floor would sort of sag when it was wet. So Saigo did not come as Katsumoto is depicted in the film as essentially being from a long lineage of honorable, noble samurai. Yeah, Saigo was not from that. He was from the lower end of the economic spectrum when it came to samurai.
Probably one of the poorest of the poor if he was about nowadays. But compared to the serfs.
Yeah, exactly. Compared to the serfs.
Living at large.
Exactly. So the samurai they had, because there were no wars to fight and they had to keep them busy, they were all paid a stipend. So being a samurai meant that every month you could essentially take a salary from the daimyo. And obviously, depending on what rank you were, the higher it was. Saigo's family was still getting a stipend, but it wasn't usually enough to maintain such a large family. So as he said, he's the eldest of 7 children. Financial struggles were constant, and Saigo's parents had to constantly borrow money to buy farmland to supplement their income. The debt was so severe, in fact, that Saigo would only begin repaying this debt once he'd achieved prominence within the Japanese political system many years later.
And does that have a sort of bad effect on his image compared to from other samurai? Is there a lot of like looking down their noses and all that kind of stuff, or do they respect someone who's on their rappers, I guess?
I think there was a general respect for it, much in the way that the Romans were constantly looking back at the sort of hardy peasants that had made Rome in the first place. The Japanese had a pretty similar look. And Saigo, although he was technically an urban samurai, they lived more like the rural samurai who were sort of self-sufficient, sitting on both sides of the social gap, gave him a kind of a broader view and more respect for the common folk that toiled in the fields as he did as a child.
Okay.
Yeah, it was sort of a contrast between his elite samurai family status and his humble reality would sort of have a profound effect on his character. From a young age, it instilled in him a strong sense of honor, humility. And even when he became a sort of powerful and wealthy man, he maintained a very simple lifestyle, choosing modest clothing and possessions. His favorite thing to do was going hunting with dogs and making his own straw sandals,
Classic hobbies, got to keep your hands busy.
Exactly. He was a simple guy, and this kind of simplicity to him would make him the sort of the fantastic leader he was. He had no real interest in kind of wielding power for personal gain in any way. He was not interested in money. He was really interested in doing what he thought was right. And we'll get into that more, but it kind of adds sort of fascinating twists to his, yeah.
See, I feel after Braveheart, maybe I am convinced about that, but I always feel that surely people aren't doing that just for something they believe in. I don't know. We'll see, won't we?
Yeah, I think hopefully by the end of the series, you will agree with me that, yeah, Saigō Takamori really does deserve all of the accolades that history has kind of poured upon him. He really is kind of a fascinating guy. So should we tell you a little bit about his education? I know that sounds like a sort of slightly boring way to start, but I think his education has a massive impact on his life. And if without understanding the way that he was educated, it'll be hard to understand some of the decisions that he makes later in life that lead to things such as the Meiji Restoration.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. I'm automatically picturing black and white school uniforms, carrying books around, bowing to teachers in classrooms. I'm assuming that's not the case.
I imagine they would have been dressed more medieval samurai children, sort of the long coats and sort of billowing trousers that you see in The Last Samurai than sort of strict school uniforms. But there would have definitely been a lot of deference to the teachers. Like all young samurai, Saigo attended a neighborhood school for the elite called a goju. These were, pretty interesting. A little bit Spartan, you might say, in more ways than one, but we'll get into that. They were fraternities, and hazing was essentially a central aspect of it. The young samurai would spend much of their time learning martial arts, group solidarity, discipline, and then sort of a rudimentary academic education.
Okay, very Spartan.
Very Spartan indeed. I think with more of a focus on actual academics than the Spartans, which was essentially just on being a hard, scary bastard. But if you'd like to hear more about that, check out our series on 300.
Yeah, the newsletter linked in the description somewhere, probably.
Something like that. The younger boys at these gojus were taught by the older boys, and they were expected to function as a military unit in times of war. Young members were not allowed to even speak to members of another goju. Yeah, as I say, they were quite Spartan, with plenty of the Greek love in there for good measure, particularly in the Satsuma region. Yeah, Satsuma, instead of Greek love, it was called Satsuma love in Japan, because of the particularly strong bond that all these boys made with each other when they were in school.
That's quite sweet, Satsuma love.
Yeah,
a good name for an album, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Some sort of slightly strange prog rock album. Yeah, so again, like ancient Greece, like homosexuality wasn't seen as a sexuality. It was sort of just seen as something you did. Obviously, you had a wife, but you might also have male lovers, and that wasn't seen as a problem. It was more seen of just, if you did too much of it, they might be like, all right, calm down on the boys.
But it's just the lads broing out, really, isn't it? It's just having a good time.
Exactly. It's just a bro job. Exactly.
Oh dear. Anyway.
Yeah. And even to the point where they had specific haircuts. So if you shaved your forelocks in a certain way with your top knot as a samurai, that indicated that you liked the lads. Because I assume they didn't want to have any sort of awkward encounters at the bars after school, things like that. Anyway, it's all kind of fascinating. The boys would essentially be schooled to the point of tears, repeating back word for word the text that they were encouraged to learn. Yeah, the only text they would be taught were ones that exhorted the virtues of Satsuma and the way of the warrior. It's not a lot of critical thinking here. It's basically learn and repeat stuff that makes your leaders look good and makes
brainwashing young boys and teaching them how to fight.
Exactly. Yeah. It was all kind of a Confucian education, and when they weren't being educated in these sort of Confucian classics, they were being hazed. They could be locked in boxes and kicked around the school, pounced on and crushed in the doggy pile by the other boys and so on.
Been through that. That's just, it's just, probably scored a goal in football or something.
Yeah, exactly. There were some slightly more macabre activities too. There was this one practice called Hiemontori, and apologies if I'm absolutely butchering all of these pronunciations. This was a competition, and the winner of this competition was given the right to practice swordsmanship on what, do you know it? A human cadaver.
Oh, every little boy's dream. Yeah. I can't believe it. Sign me up.
Yeah, exactly. The boys would assemble to watch the beheading of a condemned criminal. So if somebody was being put to death, they bring all the children out to watch. And as soon as the head had been cut off of the condemned, the boys would then rush the body, and the first to bite off an ear or a finger was the winner. Yeah.
Wow. When they talk about samurai, you sort of get this like peaceful Buddhist, only fights when they need to ideal. But this education, you know what? It's giving Nazis. Do you know what I mean? I feel like
it is slightly fascist, isn't it?
Yeah, it feels like the kind of stuff Nazi boys were doing.
I'm sure they were sort of being told to raise puppies and then kill them at the end of their training and stuff like that. Yeah. The winner then had the opportunity to practice their swordsmanship on a headless body. I think the reason that they were so keen on this is because it was essentially a time of peace. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for a samurai to actually use their sword on a human being. And obviously, if there was a battle to come along, you probably wanted to know what your sword did before you got around to using it. But still, slightly strange to be doing this. This is probably around the age of sort of 12, 13. They're all doing this.
Okay, so you've ripped off an ear. You get given a sword. You get to cut up a human cadaver, all in between doggy piling and making out with your friends and being kicked around in a box.
Yeah, and learning word for word Confucian classics. Yeah, so you might be wondering what kind of effect this had on Saigo. Surprise, surprise, it taught him all about honor and discipline, how to fight. There was a lot of fighting involved, but it also taught him how to teach and began his academic education. Saigo is remembered essentially as a fearsome warrior, but actually most of his time at the Goju was spent teaching. He got in a scrap on the way home from the Goju once with a samurai from another Goju, the ones they're not allowed to talk to. Swords were drawn and Saigo lost. I didn't lose a limb or anything like that, but his arm was injured to the point where actually his sword arm took a long time to heal. So most of his time at school was actually spent on academics. And that's how most of his classmates would remember him.
And he was well loved at school?
Yeah, it's one of those things hard to say through the lens of time. When you've been at school with someone who turns out to be a sort of a famous national hero, you're always going to tell everyone that you were best mates,
Oh, sure. Yeah. Like us with Richard Hammond.
Yeah, exactly. Richard Hammond at the Elm School. Okay, let's take a break. Hello and welcome back. We are going to continue discussing the education of Saigō Takamori. Bear with me, we will be through it in just a moment, but this next part is very important for understanding the trajectory that his life takes.
Okay, yeah, hit me.
The Goju, we were discussing in the first half, was but part of Saigo's education. He also attended the Domain Academy, also known as the Zoshikan.
Wow, well done on that.
Yeah, I know. I'm absolutely nailing these pronunciations today, I think.
Yeah, and I would know.
Yeah, exactly. A couple of white English dudes pronouncing Japanese words, nailing it. Yeah. It was here at the Domain Academy that Saigo developed the philosophies that would shape his life. So they are worth touching on to get an understanding of the man he was to become. Here, Saigo received a classical education. For centuries, and across the East Asian world, Confucianism had dominated intellectual thought. Saigo learned and perfected his understanding of the 4 books and the 5 classics. Now, I'm not going to go into each one in detail, but these focused on instilling loyalty, honor, and courage. So pretty similar to the education of the Goju, but more in depth. They would have a profound impact on Saigo and led him to emotionally expressing himself in classical Chinese for the rest of his life. Most of his poems, such as the one I so fantastically read at the top of the episode, were written in Chinese and referenced Chinese themes.
So how did the Japanese feel about him speaking in Chinese? Is that fine? Is that cool? Is that kind of trendy?
Classical Chinese is fine. They were a little bit racist about the Chinese, and in a later episode, we'll get to a point where Saigo, spoiler alert, is exiled and has to live with some Chinese that he's not very fond of at first. But classical Chinese, it was at the core of their own philosophy as well.
So kind of like Latin for us.
Exactly. Yeah. So okay. They held no real prejudices over these kind of ancient Confucian texts. There was an interpretation of the text taught to Saigo that was known as Zhu Shi thought. It taught that everything was governed by a universal set of principles and that there was no differentiation between moral and natural philosophy. So one must study the natural world to understand morality.
You know what? I really get that in his poem, I think. The way he talks about what decisions to make in the sort of the same way he talks about the sunflower looking at the sun.
No, definitely. Yeah, exactly. It definitely had a profound effect on him. It advocates a broad curriculum. Sounds quite nice, actually, to be honest, including reading, sitting quietly, ritual practice, physical exercise, and obviously reading the books and so on.
You would love the first 2. That's you in a nutshell, isn't it?
Reading and sitting quietly. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I like the physical exercise as well, being part of philosophy. I think that's nice. It was, however, purely theoretical and academic and couldn't really be applied to the political world. So Saigo and many others at the time would have struggled to see its real valid importance in their day-to-day life. To bridge the gap in this learning, Saigo was not one to just sort of take the education that came to him. He sort of started branching out and looking elsewhere. And he looked beyond the Zhu Shi thought to a critique of the philosophy called Yang Ming.
University lecturers nowadays would have absolutely loved him by the sounds of it.
Yeah, he would have been asking a lot of questions.
Going beyond the curriculum.
Exactly.
We'd love to see it.
So While both philosophies draw on the same texts as ones I mentioned earlier, Yang Ming stressed experience and action over scholarship. While Zhu Ji encouraged study and reflection, Yang Ming stressed appreciating and following one's moral compass through actions and not thought alone. The goal of understanding virtue, said Yang Ming, was to act on it. This way of thinking, understandably, has a sort of slightly revolutionary edge to it. If you believe something, you must do something about it. And as such, was banned by the shogunate. As I mentioned though earlier, the Satsuma had never really cared much for the rules of the shogunate, and so hid their study of philosophy in plain sight, where they advertised their philosophical schools as studying Zhu Ji, but then in the classrooms themselves, they would actually just cover Yang Ming.
Yeah. Okay. So Yang Ming is pretty much saying actions speak louder than words.
Exactly.
To sum it up, cool. I could do this.
If you believe something, it is your moral prerogative to do something about it.
And this is Confucianism as well, is it?
Yeah, so it's an interpretation of Confucianism, yeah. A critique of it. And Saigo was so inspired by these teachings that he personally transcribed 101 of the teachings into a personal handbook that he kept on him at all times. They would have a profound impact on his worldview and actions in the future, and that future was knocking at the door, as Saigo's formal education was coming to an end, and it was time for Saigo, the man, to go to work.
So how old is he at this point? How old do they finish their formal education?
I'd say around 18, 20 years old, something like that.
Okay. And he's moved out of his home, has he? He's left his family behind?
No, he would have still been living at home. But the thing is, about this point in Saigo's life, he hadn't really done anything of note at this point. He was the oldest son of a middlingly successful lower samurai who'd gone to school like everyone else. So there isn't a huge amount of information about him because up to this point, he wasn't a very remarkable character.
Sure.
But he had in his youth shown essentially a fascination for learning. He's a big guy by this point. I didn't really mention it earlier.
A taste for ears.
Yeah, a taste for ears. Actually, it doesn't say whether he was one of the ones that bit the ears off, but he was 6 foot. He was enormous. He kind of carried himself around. This is 6 foot in Japan at the time where the average height would have been significantly lower than that. So he was sort of this enormous...
Like the William Wallace equivalent, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. We love a big hero on History vs. Hollywood. Yeah, he was just sort of this enormous, bear-like, highly educated, sort of taciturn character who, could swing a sword. That's for sure. But yeah, as I say, it's time for him to go to work. He didn't initially start out going straight for politics. And the problem is it's going to be a little bit unsatisfying, but we don't really know why or how he got into politics. He followed his father into the taxation office, and his duties were essentially like inspecting farms, supervising village officials, encouraging agricultural production, and so on. And nothing at this point indicates that he would one day become this sort of massively impressive national leader. But then seemingly, all of a sudden, in the year 1854, Saigo was promoted from assistant tax clerk to Lord's attendant. Bit of a promotion. Yeah, and so this would have been Lord's attendant to the daimyo of the Satsuma domain, was a guy named Shimatsu Nariakira.
Is that a big leap? Did leaps like that happen often?
No. This is as high a leap as one could go as a samurai, and it happened almost overnight.
So what we can know is that whatever happened, it was probably very impressive.
Exactly.
He impressed someone a lot.
Exactly. And so it's an early indication. He's a very impressive figure, as you'll see as we go on. But clearly, even at this point in his youth, he was so impressive that he was immediately demanded, the daimyo demanded, I need that guy by my side whilst I'm going about my business in the future. So whatever happened, Saigo joined his lord's retinue just in time for the biennial trip to Edo. This was part of the shogunate's control over the daimyo. As I say, they had a sort of deferential relationship with them where they were semi-independent. But the shogun demanded this biennial trip whereby the daimyo themselves would spend every other full year in Edo, sort of living within the vicinity of the shogunate. And then the other year in their own domains. but their families and their children stayed in Edo the entire time. So it's sort of like a polite hostage taking to make sure that they didn't rebel too much, because if they did, the shogun's kind of assassins were, within a few minutes of their families.
Okay. So it's a clever idea. It's you can sort of pretend that you're inviting them round to hang out, but actually you got your knives poised.
Exactly. And I'm sure the invitations were always very polite. Oh, we would love the honor of your presence once again in Edo. But, if you didn't come, there would be genuine problems.
You know what? We had actions speak louder than words. Now we've got keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. They're just full of these.
Exactly.
Aren't they?
So Saigo was invited to come along. The last 1 minute, he's a clerk, and the next, he's joining his lord, Nariakira, on the long walk to visit the shogun and spend a year with him in Edo.
100-day walk, I've heard somewhere.
Exactly. It's about a 900-mile walk. Obviously, Nariakira as a lord would have been carried there, and I can't remember the name for it. Essentially, sort of a human-drawn carriage, but Saigo and the other samurai accompanying him would have traveled there on foot.
Good thing he's had so much practice making those straw sandals, hey?
Yeah, exactly.
Wear through a few of those.
Yeah, there's a good thing about straw sandals. You can just rebuild them every day when they fall apart.
Yeah, very true.
Interestingly, though, on the way to Edo, Saigo would see the sign of the changing of the ages. As it was on the way to Edo that Saigo, for the first time in his life, most likely, would have seen signs of an advanced civilization outside of Asia. Matthew Perry's fleet, not that Matthew Perry.
Wow.
Yeah,
that threw me off. Chandler Bing's fleet.
Yeah. Admiral Matthew Perry, an American admiral, had in 1853, after almost 250 years of isolationism by Japan, had turned up in Japanese waters and began to try and crack open Japanese isolationism, essentially at the barrel of a gun. The fleet turned up and they practiced a thing called aggressive non-violence, where they didn't sort of come in and open fire on the Japanese. But what they did do is they turned up with a fleet of steam-powered battleships, absolutely brimming to the teeth with cannons and guns. And
could I have any more guns? Oh, that was silly.
No, that was good. That's exactly what we have you on the show for. And yeah, basically they sailed into Japanese waters. The Japanese came out and said, "Stop, please. No, you're not allowed." And Matthew Perry essentially was like, "What are you going to do about it?" He sailed right under the guns of Japanese fortresses, and one of his ships alone was more heavily armed than the fortresses kind of raid up against him. So he dropped anchor, sent some guys to shore, and basically told them that you are opening yourself to negotiations. We are going to sign a trade treaty with you, whether you like it or not. The time for Japanese isolationism is over.
What a terrifying sight that must have been for someone like Saigo, growing up in his sort of semi-rural, straw-footed, ear-biting civilization, to come in and see these ships like belching smoke and putting their foot down. And Matthew Perry's probably absolutely stinking.
Yeah, absolutely honking. Yeah, and it's really interesting because this really is the clashing of periods of time. Japan to this point was essentially still medieval. They did have guns, they had rifles and things like that, but modern technology, the Industrial Revolution, had not made it to Japan yet. And it's going to be really weird later in this series where once the Meiji Restoration has happened, you'll start hearing stories about the samurai sending a delegation to San Francisco, and just saying those two things in the same sentence to me come across really odd.
Yeah, that is
samurai going to San Francisco. It just seems two things that shouldn't be said in the same sentence together.
So does Saigo have any thoughts on those ships? Anything we know of?
Yeah, so from his letters, you can see that, first of all, Saigo was not a sort of cultural conservative. He was about embracing the future. Obviously, they would have been shocking to him, seeing these sort of black ships arrayed, forcing their way into Japan, kind of against Japan's will. Obviously, he was very concerned about the influence of Western imperialism, particularly because any good patriot, he didn't want Japan to become another sort of Western colony. That was absolutely not on the cards for him. However, the future had arrived, Saigo was ready to adopt it, but he wasn't sure how ready Japan was for the future just yet. Kind of his take.
Okay, so he was sort of a radical left by comparison. Is that fair to say at this point, or
not yet? You will meet some radicals later in the story, and he does side with them. But no, at this point, he is still he's not thinking about massive political changes just yet. At this point in his career, he's still basically brand new to the world of politics, but he has a good head on his shoulders, and he can see, there's not much they can do about this kind of advanced civilization knocking on the door. They need to deal with it with strength rather than kind of ignoring it or letting them kind of tread all over them.
Okay, so 100 days and 20 pairs of straw sandals later, he arrives in Edo. What happens then?
So Saigo arrives at Edo, and it kind of blows his mind, basically. It's absolutely enormous. Even by this point, Tokyo, I think now has a population of 30 million. But even at this point, there was over 1 million people living there. So it would be far bigger than any city or population center that you'd ever seen. Temptation lay at every corner. There are bars and brothels and,
Were they geisha at that point?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, tough.
And Saigo, he liked a lady of the night, absolutely. Later on in his career, he was famed for having a sort of romantic affair with the fattest geisha in Edo. He liked a big woman. That's for sure. Yeah.
Go on, Saigo.
Exactly. Everyone would razz him about it, but he didn't care. He liked him big.
Man who stuck to his principles.
Exactly, yeah.
His huge principles.
His enormous principles, yeah. But Saigo is actually, as I say, he's a smart guy, so he doesn't let the temptation kind of absorb him, this big new city, and goes about sort of making new intellectual friends and sort of starts writing home to his parents about all the new and interesting people he's met. And these new intellectual pursuits and friendships would, again, further define his philosophy that would lead to the sort of enormous events of his life. He started off his duty in Edo as, he was called the gardener, which is essentially a secret word for Lord's messenger. But whenever asked, he would say he was his Lord's gardener. And this meant that he could, pretty badass, to be honest. This meant that he could kind of come and go as he pleased, but he was kind of ferrying messages between Narikira, his daimyo, and their allies and so on. So he really was very quickly at the heart of the sort of political machinations in Edo. But when he wasn't working, he, as I say, was making some new friends, and he got very into this new philosophy that would actually change his life and Japan's future forever. And that's called Mito learning. I know we just stopped talking about his education, but he's kind of a lifelong learner. And without talking about this again, you also won't really understand how he ends up the way he does.
Okay, so tell me about Mito.
Yes, so this is essentially a form of imperial loyalism developed by scholars in another domain. So you have Satsuma, there's another one called the Mito domain. And this is where all of Saigo's new friends were from. This is a branch of the Tokugawa house, sort of from like an 11th son of the original Tokugawa shogunate. So it's sort of a long time separated from the shoguns. Instead of emphasizing deference to the shogunate, it emphasized the importance of the imperial institution. So we mentioned that although the shogun is in charge, nominally the emperor is still the ruler of Japan, but it's sort of been sidelined. This new philosophy emphasized the importance of the imperial institution, highlighting that they were descended from the gods and Japan was a land of the gods and should be ruled over by the descendants of the gods. And on top of that, any foreigners in the land would taint the land of the gods. So it's sort of slightly xenophobic, but imperial focused new philosophy. Saigo was not totally keen on all of it. He liked the idea. He was sort of tantalized by the idea of sort of ultimate deference to the emperor. Saigo has kind of always been looking for a daddy in his life.
Okay,
so
sure.
At this moment, he's very, very happy. He's been sort of selected by his daimyo, Narikira, and Narikira and him have this sort of idyllic, kind of perfect relationship where all he has to do is serve his lord, and he's very happy with that. On top of that, he liked the idea of serving the emperor of Japan as well. He was a big fan of that idea. But it's still, at this point, he wasn't a big fan of the foreigners not being allowed in the country. He saw that as kind of unenforceable and potentially detrimental in the future, and also just a little bit xenophobic. And also at this point, the philosophy wasn't so much about the emperor ruling directly with a sort of iron fist. They didn't want to completely change the political system. They still wanted daimyos to essentially be in charge, but deferring to the emperor rather than deferring to the shogun. So the emperor would reign but not rule.
So this wasn't a passive philosophical intellectual conversation. These were people hoping to enforce action.
Yeah, exactly. So there were people who, it was sort of the beginning of a political movement that would kind of rack Japan in the years to come. As this philosophy spread and was taken up by more people, they became a sort of more powerful political entity. But in the meantime, we'll get to that at some point. Saigo got stuck into the political life in Edo. He was, as I say, he's been a good boy. He was working to undermine his lord's enemies and build friendships that would benefit Satsuma. He became particularly close with the guys from the Mito domain, which you'd think, you've been brought by your own daimyo to help out, and then now you're hanging out with all these guys from Mito. Not much of a problem. Not only did Narihiro trust Saigo, but him and the daimyo from the Mito domain also had a pretty good working relationship too.
Okay, so sort of alliance going on here.
Yeah,
maybe.
Exactly.
Great.
But then big political forces were moving. There was a succession crisis forming in the shogunate. As the current shogun was essentially very infirm, they think he probably had epilepsy, but he sort of couldn't sit upright for more than half an hour at a time without sort of getting very tired. They didn't expect him to live long.
Okay, and does the shogun inherit sort of through? Does it inherit through blood, or is it sort of strongest wins, or how does it work?
Yeah, so it would have been probably the eldest son if there was one. But the shogun also has, like kings in Europe, they sort of have the power to choose their successor. But there was no real obvious successor. And this is obviously a time of immense political crisis in Japan because of the arrival of the West. Suddenly they're being bullied by Western imperialists. And so they needed strong leadership if they were to basically stand up to these guys. As I say, he had no children. And when the son of the daimyo of the Mito domain was proposed, so as I say, the Mito domain was from a sort of 11th son of the original shogunates. They will still technically related to the Tokugawas some way. Saigo found himself torn between the wishes of his friends in the Mito domain, who obviously wanted their guy to be the successor, and the desire to serve his lord, because he didn't know his lord's mind at the time. So he didn't know if, he went and supported his friends, whether Narihiro, his daimyo, would be upset with him.
Of course, was there a chance Narihiro was punching for that spot?
No.
Himself?
No. But Narihiro, it turned out, was actually very happy because this guy, Kaiki, I'm not sure how to pronounce the one. We'll go with Kiki, the proposed successor, was sort of a young, smart, swashbuckling, dashing guy, just the sort of strong leader they could all get around at the time. So the Satsuma and the Mito guys were aligned on that. So that was good.
And just remember, these Mito guys are the guys who are pushing for a more imperial-based rule as well.
Yeah, exactly. And Saigo then was getting closer and closer with his lord because they were agreeing on everything. And they were both working in the backgrounds to get this Keiki guy arrived. His star was really in the ascendant. Within just a few short years, he'd gone from being this low-level tax clerk to being at the center of Japanese politics. So much to the point, when it came time for Narihiro to return to Satsuma after being there for a year, he left Saigo behind as his trusted agent in the city. His main job would be to promote Keiki as the next shogun. He was doing a bang-up job of it. In this time, Saigo's horizons would be broadened, and he began to reject more strongly the xenophobic aspects of Mito ideology whilst taking on the other parts of the ideology more strongly.
But this wasn't probably because he was magically less racist. It was, do you think, just because he was more aware of the inevitability of it?
Absolutely.
Perhaps?
I think, you can definitely, it's a practical understanding of, first of all, what the West can bring to Japan. He wanted them to deal with the West from a position of strength. He could see their technology, he could see their philosophies, ways of government as being very beneficial for the country, as long as they weren't sort of pushed around too much. And that obviously meant having foreigners in Japan. So he was for that, basically.
So yeah, at this time in his life, I mean, compared to him fighting on the other side later on, at this time in his life, he seems like any sort of young, up-and-coming, educated person, pretty left-wing, open to new ideas, embracing the future. But I assume eventually that will change, right?
Yeah. So as you say, again, at this point, like he is at the center of politics. His star is in the ascendant, and you're right, he is an up and comer, but he hasn't really done anything super dramatic. Like why are we talking about this guy? At the moment, he just seems kind of a run of the mill guy. And we will get to that eventually. But you're about to see some changes that affect him in a big way. You start to see some of the sort of heroic, sort of dramatic turns in his life that start to build his legend. And this all started because, yeah, Saigo and his allies were actually doing a pretty good job in pushing this Keiki guy, even to the point where they traveled to Kyoto and they managed to convince the imperial house to step in and promote Keiki again as the next shogun. So this is all proceeding well. But this was the first time in centuries, essentially, that the imperial house had directly involved themselves in shogunate politics. So it doesn't sound like much, they just stepped in and said, you should probably go for this guy. But this was actually kind of a cataclysmic change in the way things have been going in Japan. And this is all kind of down to Saigo and his allies. Allies? I said that twice. Saigo and his allies. Saigo, pushing them. So he's starting to make these big political moves.
So he's suddenly sort of, it would be like the leader of the Tories convincing King Charles to come out and say, I want this person to be, for a very bad analogy.
Yeah, exactly. So as I say, it all was proceeding very well, but there were some subcurrents. At this point, he's still a young man, and maybe Saigo's political antennae were not quite as in tune as they would be later in his life, because he was essentially about to be completely sideswiped by a deteriorating crisis in the succession fight that he was involved in. So the shogunate, seeing that the imperial house had stepped in and for the first time in centuries decided to directly involve themselves in politics, this is obviously bad news for the shogun. At the moment, the shogunate wasn't very strong. They didn't have a good successor. And now the other potential source of power in the country is weighing in, further kind of weakening their position. They decided it was time to make a move. Led by a man named Lee Naosuke, who was basically a powerful member of the culturally conservative old elite. They built a secret counter movement using their own contacts within the imperial court and managed to very quickly, sort of out of nowhere, derail Keiki's succession challenge and get the emperor himself to kind of come out and be like, no, it's not going to happen.
Okay, so they talked to the imperial house themselves, made probably bribes changing hands, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
A few threats. Okay.
Exactly. And then all of a sudden, Saigo and his allies, I've done it again. Saigo and his allies are, caught with their pants down. All of a sudden, they are on the wrong side of the new successor to the shogunate, which is this guy, Lee.
And is this, at this time, a dangerous, life-threatening place to be?
It certainly would become. It certainly would be. Lee consolidates his power very quickly. He invents a new role called the Grand Counselor and outright rejected Keiki as the heir apparent and named a much younger, more easily controllable alternative, an 8-year-old cousin of the sitting shogun, so much kind of easier to manipulate. Sensing this impending crisis, Saigo legs it from Edo in 1858 to Kagoshima to see his lord. Nari Akira then sort of explodes in rage at the turn of events and sent Saigo to Kyoto to shore up support, even considering putting together a military expedition and attacking Edo to, support Keiki back into power. He did not think this was a time for weak leadership in the country. And so he actually was perfectly happy to invade the capital and deal with this pretender to the throne. So Saigo went with much haste to Kyoto. But shortly after he arrived, he received some devastating news that his lord Nari Akira, who he'd just been speaking to, just exploded with rage, had suddenly died.
How did that happen?
As I say, it's hard to tell. It sounds like a little bit like he was poisoned. He kind of came down with an extreme case of the shits, basically. But he went from being sort of a perfectly healthy man in 2 to 3 days, essentially shitting himself to death, dying. So they assume he was poisoned. This was kind of a shock. It
must have been a blow to Saigo.
Yeah, not only was this kind of a massive political blow to first of all, the Satsuma domain. Saigo took all of his political authority from his close relationship with Nariakira. Like I said, he doesn't have a family lineage to rely on or vast wealth or anything like that. He is only an important figure in politics because Nariakira likes him a lot. And on top of that, he also had a very close relationship, sort of lord-vassal relationship that fed into his personal interpretation of Bushido that he was very satisfied with. So it was kind of an absolute blow for him.
Yeah, I can imagine. And probably also his closeness with this lord and his sudden rise. Do you think maybe he would have alienated him against some of Nariakira's allies? Do you think? So even more sort of lost in the dark.
Yeah, exactly. It absolutely did. And we didn't really touch on it earlier, but when Nariakira came to power, there was a succession struggle again within Satsuma itself. Two factions, and Nariakira ended up coming on top with the support of Saigo. But that meant that there were quite a lot of people in the Satsuma domain who probably would have considered themselves Saigo's political enemies. You know, they were on the same side now, but with Nariakira's death, Saigo was suddenly very exposed.
So what does he do?
First of all, very dramatic. He considers returning to Kagoshima and committing ritual suicide on Nariakira's grave, but he's instead persuaded by a friend, this guy called Gesho, who's a monk, to return with him to Kyoto, meet with other sort of pro-imperial partisans that were pro-Keiki, and begin gathering support for a military intervention in Edo.
So this is the classic case. It's a tale as old as time, isn't it? When you've got outside pressure and there's succession struggle because of how much importance there is behind it, that tends to kick off some sort of civil war, which I assume is the direction this is going now.
Yeah, very, very potentially. This is kind of what Saigo is looking for, I think, as well. He's, to be honest, he's young and he's still quite rash at this point. But yes, he's perfectly happy to essentially plunge the realm into civil war to make sure that this Keiki guy goes on the throne. However, the shogunate has spies and police everywhere, and they respond to these threats with a swift crackdown on all dissent. A purge sort of sweeps through the realm with many loyal and famous samurai being detained and killed. Luckily for Saigo, when he's in Kyoto, he is warned of the approaching threat. So him and Gesho, his friend, flee Kyoto in the night, flee back to Kagoshima. Saigo and Gesho are now wanted men. And then upon arriving back into Kagoshima, Saigo finds a changed domain. You know, his lord is dead. He no longer commands the favor he had whilst Nariakira was alive. His political power is spent, basically. And as such, his friend Gesho, who was also a wanted man, who is not from the Satsuma domain, was not offered sanctuary by the shogunate. So the shogunate, the Satsuma domain, were happy to protect Saigo, but they would not extend him any further courtesy than that. You know, he was a Satsuma man. We're not going to let the shogunate get them because, let's face it, fuck the shogunate. But this Gesho guy, he's a wanted man. You know, do with him as you wish, but we're not going to offer him shelter.
He's not our person, yeah.
Exactly. Sure. So obviously Saigo is absolutely crushed. He is now in the political doldrums, essentially. He has no clout anymore. So his friend Gesho, upon hearing the news, they've been running for a while. This is quite a long way from Kyoto to Satsuma. He tells Saigo that he's not going to run any further, and he would rather die than fall into the hands of the shogunate. Saigo's outlook at this point was equally bleak. He was devastated about the death of his lord. So they decided they were going to take a little trip out into Kagoshima Bay with each other. So they traveled that night by boat into the middle of the bay. Saigo and Gesho sat in the bow together and they reminisced and talked of better times and the way they wished the future would go for their land. They stared in wonder at the beauty of the temple of Shingakuji, whose lights they could see twinkling on the shore. Then they embraced each other and without a word, threw themselves into the icy water of Kagoshima Bay. Looking forward to death, Saigo inhaled the frigid, salty water and drifted away into blackness.
Wow, that was the story of The Last Samurai. Thank you for bringing us some of that one-parter. Gosh, what a dramatic ending.
Yeah, so who knows? Will Saigo survive? That is the question.
That is the question. And we'll find out one way, won't we, on the next episode of The Last Samurai.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, there's going to be probably 4 episodes. So you might guess as to what's going to happen.
Fascinated by this character. I can't wait to hear the rest of the story.
He's an interesting guy, isn't he?
Yeah, very interesting. There's that pull towards the samurai, isn't there? There's something about it, just along with knights and maybe Romans and Greeks. I feel like there's just something that just it scratches an itch in your brain, doesn't it?
Totally.
Really,
it's sort of like honorable warrior that kind of, I think every bloke like secretly thinks they probably would be, if they were in that situation. You don't think you're going to be like a boring farmer in feudal Japan. You're going to be a samurai. You're not going to. But it's a fascinating story. And yeah, there's lots more of it to come. So please join us next time to find out the fate of Saigō Takamori. What happens to him? Would he survive? And if he does, what happens next?
Will he lead a political revolution? Let's find out next time.
Yeah. So thank you very much for joining us. This has been another episode of History vs. Hollywood. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you again for listening to an episode of History vs. Hollywood. I really hope you've enjoyed the show. You might have noticed, but I'm just beginning to get this show off the ground, and it would be invaluable to have your support in doing so. The best way you can help us out is by leaving a review wherever you're listening. You can do this on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, wherever. If you happen to be listening directly in Substack, perhaps you could just let me know what you thought in the comments. If you like the show, please go ahead and like it. You can restack it, or if you really like the show, then perhaps you would consider adding me to your recommendations. That would be absolutely amazing. On top of that, there is a paid option, so you could consider upgrading your subscription. That would go a very long way to supporting me, helping me pay my artists and contributors, and buy research materials that make this all possible. But that's completely optional. I'm just happy to have you here and listening. So thank you once again, and we'll see you next time for another episode of History vs. Hollywood. Goodbye.